Jeff Ranke, editorial director of manufacturing.net and manufacturing business technology. Welcome to Security Breach. So, while I utilize that editorial director title to introduce myself before every episode of Security Breach, it's not the title that I've used the longest, think about the most, or with which I would hope to obtain the most critical acclaim. Rather, the job descriptor that meets all those requirements is Dad. And perhaps the phrase most commonly utilized during my ongoing tenure in this position is some form of the question, are you ready? Whether it was preparing to push a swing, toss a pitch, or start a car, inquiring as to the state of my daughter's readiness was always the first, and I would say most important, but yet also the most basic action that I took. I was reminded of this when speaking with our guest for today's episode, Itzik Kotler, the co-founder and CTO of SafeBreach. While our conversation took us down a number of paths in discussing shiny objects, the problems with silos, and the evolution of hackers, he kept coming back to the basics, or what I like to constantly describe as the blocking and tackling of cybersecurity. At the heart of the focus on the basics is taking steps to be prepared for when, not if, you're targeted by hackers. So in teeing up this episode, all I have to say is, are you ready? One of the things that we were going to talk about a little bit is the way that maybe breaches have evolved a little bit. There's been a lot going on, and sort of the characteristics of the attackers and the attacks have changed a little bit. What have been some of the changes you've seen maybe over the 5+ years that have had the biggest impact on the way SafeBreach kind of goes after things?
Of course, and it's great to be here, Jeff. So yes, obviously the offensive landscape has changed, and it's constantly been changing. And some of it has to do with some recent development like AI, and we can touch a little bit about how AI is putting more asymmetrical relationship between the offense and defense. But I will say, just in all honesty, as we adopted technology everywhere and every employee today has access to his company, I think the notion is that there is no such thing as a bad hack. I mean, hackers used to be very targeted to go to certain companies that have certain assets or resource. But today, if you think about it, you're either the target or you're a supply chain to a bigger target. So in all honesty, if you're getting hacked, even as a simple employee, using your computer as a footprint within your company, and even if your company is not an interesting company, but you serve a big bank or a big hospital, and that VPN, that connectivity could be that missing link, it really just makes that everybody is a target, and everybody just need to think about, whether it's a phishing or it's, just picking up a thumb drive and plug it into their computers. So it really just increased the incentive to just hack everybody.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, it's interesting too, because you brought up a couple of really interesting points there. The first one we can dive into a little bit is all these connections that are going on. When we look at our audience in the industrial sector and on the plant floor specifically, just mammoth amount of new connections that are coming online, and some of the technologies we have in place to manage these connections is lacking at times. What have you seen as maybe some of the bigger challenges, bigger solutions that have been put forth to manage all of these connections?
Yeah, so I would say first, let's kind of dive a little bit into the problem that you mentioned, or why is that the problem? So first of all, everybody wants metrics these days. Everybody wants their devices to send some kind of a usage or analytics so they can watch out their capacity, their power consumption, their uptime. And this obviously drives more connectivity. And in most cases, it drives connectivity to a cloud or some kind of an external assets that would be able to collect all these metrics. So this is one type of a problem. Also the interconnectivity, we expect things to be smart today. We expect them to kind of negotiate or understand their environment and do things differently if there is a certain thing on the network or something doesn't work on the network. So again, we also see this interconnectivity it's been increasing. So I think the traditional approach that many companies still do is try to create a clear segmentation and a clear path to who's supposed to talk with what. Now, this concept, sometimes today it's been rebranded as zero trust or microsegmentation. It's not a relatively new concept. However, it is very hard to implement in practice, certainly because as you update and upgrade those devices, as you add more devices, keeping track of all these IPs, of all these entities, is just becoming a very cumbersome task. So sometimes company just opens up. They just say, well, just let it work, let it do what it needs to do. And unfortunately, that's exactly the type of conditions that are ripe for then hacking those devices on the flip side.
In the segmentation conversation, it's really interesting to me because that seems to be something that hackers are leveraging. They're finding ways to worm into different parts of an enterprise that they may not have even been intentionally targeting at times. When you're working with customers out there, again, in the industrial sector, there's just so much stuff that we have to deal with, so many assets to cover.
Sure.
Is there some ways, some jumping off points or some tips that you've seen, things that have been working, best practices, if you will, for at least initiating that segmentation process, and then ways to keep it going? Because I think a lot of times in the OT environment, we get started and then we stop because we think we're good for now. How do you keep that momentum rolling a little bit?
Yeah, I think the IoT or the OT section obviously have unique challenges that also revolves around the criticality of the devices, their need to kind of outperform all the time, to be 24/7, and sometimes even the software hardware components that are sometimes not modernized to work, for instance, with identity solutions or things that perhaps the enterprise has already adopted. But in general, if you just kind of zoom out, it's unfortunate that cyber hygiene is never been a buzz. It's never been something that people buy into. It's always kind of easier, unfortunately, in this information security industry, to point to some kind of a shiny object and say, well, we really just need to achieve that or get to that place. But unfortunately, cyber hygiene is a very basic ideas. And as you said, sometimes people start and they don't follow up with them, or sometimes they just do it for a while and then they just think that there is no return of investment. And then again, they get convinced that it's really just about that gizmo, that shiny little thing that they should be going after. But, we can always start with the basics, permissions. Who really need to access the jump server? Who really needs to have the access to these OT, IT, and enterprise environments? And though sometimes there could be exceptions, maintenance, outside vendors, third parties, do we remember to shut down the access when they leave? Do we remember to provoke the access when they're no longer needed? Again, nothing here is earth-shattering. Nothing here is like inventing, a new type of technology. But it's those basic things, accounts that are being staying dormant, passwords that are not being rotated, MFAs that are not being enabled, different exceptions that used to have some legacy reasons that are no longer required, but nobody remembered that and nobody wants to touch it. It's always the complexity. When I speak to my customers, I tell them that what hackers are doing the best is exploiting the complexity that these companies have against them. And when you think about it, it's a bit interesting because when a hacker comes to a company, it's your playground. Initially, if you understand your lay of the land, you can make their life a nightmare and you can catch them just at the door because you can set traps and you can point them towards servers or resources that that your regular employees and services should not be touching upon. But a lot of companies kind of give up this element of surprise. They already fall into the trap of being reactive, and then they try to chase the adversary. And again, it all starts with mapping the complexity. Why are things as they are? Why we need to change them, and how we make sure that these changes are being implemented, not just today, but through the entire life cycle of the company, the product line, the business, whichever it may be for them.
Absolutely. I like your shiny object analogy because I think that's really the case in a lot of organizations. I think it's interesting though, because sometimes that shiny object that can be used sort of in an advantageous way to get more of the funds and more of an investment internally that we need. I think it's more just where we place that shiny object on the roadmap. Is it closer to us or is it further away? And trying to use that to get greater buy-in. And I think that leads into a bigger conversation really about initiating or trying to embed cybersecurity into the culture of an organization and some of the challenges that can come with that.
I totally agree with you. And I think, there is no doubt that depending on the company that you work with and depends on the company internal politics, some companies understand security and sometimes this understanding comes from regulation or external forces that kind of make the company become aware of it and committed. And some companies are not in that phase yet. And so the people there are trying to kind of leverage the marketing of those new shiny objects as a way to rationalize why the company should invest in that area or should buy into it. But as I said, unfortunately, cyber hygiene doesn't have such a good marketing. That it's such a basic concept, but it's not something that people really can take pride to say, oh, today I remove a couple of legacy firewall rules. Today I remove a couple of users that never should have been there in the first place because they were a one-time exception. It's much more easier to align yourself into a trend, to maybe go to a conference and lecture to your peers about how you were the first to implement that. And I get it, but as we said, unfortunately, the reality is, and again, I want to believe that most companies that have sensible investments in information security, they can stop an attack. They cannot stop all the phases of the attack. I'm not claiming that you can stop the 0-day or the lateral movement, but when you have a sensible risk management, there could be a point in time in the kill chain that you can then triage on the attack and stop it there. Now, again, depending on the company, the risk management, you might want it to be a bit more sooner, or again, maybe if your budget is lower, then you can only, delay it into the actual exfiltration or data destruction. But be as it may be, I believe companies should have that ability, and most of them do. Again, a lot of times they're just not aware of how the attack would look like, and though they're a bit blind about that. So they're really going to exercise it when they're already under attack. And again, it's a missed opportunity. Remember, they're coming to your house. The attacker is trying to hack your company. If you play your cards right, you can do a lot of things. But like I said, that advantage is almost always wasted. And some new gizmo promise the world, and then the commercial reality sets in and it's not.
Yeah. A lot of what you just talked about there, when we talk about sort of the human element and company culture and risk awareness, I just kind of wonder, when we have these conversations about cybersecurity, we want to get away from the shaming and blaming when people click on a bad link or do something like that. We also don't want to alarm people to the point where they get afraid and see cybersecurity as this daunting task and sort of take a head in the sand approach. But at the same time, we need to generate awareness and talk to people about the seriousness and how far-reaching the impacts of cybersecurity are. This is kind of a tough question, but what's the line there? I mean, when you're talking to clients or folks, how do you get them engaged without freaking them out, so to speak, when it comes to cybersecurity and the different things they have to do?
It's a great question. And I think it needs to start with, we talked about risk assessment, but kind of, demystifying it a little bit. It starts with understanding your threat modeling. Who realistically are you up against? And this is also something that I see often customers and just people in the industry sometimes make a mistake where they're saying, okay, I think the Russians are after me or the Chinese are after me. Well, if you try to take a company and kind of set them up to be against a nation state, and you don't have the budget and you don't have the people's commitment, then yeah, every day could be like a flooding, nonstop threatening. You talk to people about what that email, what kind of click did you link, did you report it? I mean, and it's not going to be realistic because these, again, as we said about, you probably are being targeted most likely by cyber criminals and just kind of a drive-by attacks. And again, this is not to say that some companies really should consider nation states because of their business. But again, for most companies, you're probably not on their list of these nation states. So it all starts with an honest understanding of which risk you should be accepting and which risk you can't accept. And the ones that you can accept, there is multiple ways to address it. Like first is, where does technology brings you? Right? Like, for instance, if you're afraid of emails, like where does your email gateway bring you? And is it an acceptable level? Maybe you should buy 2 email gateways. Maybe the residual risk after buying 2 would be one that is acceptable by the company. And then you can tell people that, look, if something do end up passing and you get this email and there's no warning, again, exercise common sense, right? Don't ever wave up your ability to judge whether this email is real and really is justified. But you can have some level of certainty that whatever passes these 2 huge checkpoints is probably a risk that you're willing to go with. And then you can talk about compensating controls, EDRs, and what else can help kick in if the user makes the mistake. Try to make it all about the human element. You should be understanding that every email is a malicious email. that's not cultivating a culture of collaboration and understanding. Again, there's no doubt that there is a place for education and awareness. We should never discount the fact that humans are in most cases the weakest link, because technology doesn't get tired, technology doesn't have holidays, doesn't have 9 to 5. But again, making it all about the human mistake and the blaming is not going to take you where you need to be. It needs to be a sensible compromise between where your technology brings you. And by the way, this is also a budget constraint, right? Do you have the budget to buy the best of breed, or you need to make some compromises there as well? So it's where you invest, it's what the residual risk, it's where your employees and how committed they are to your threat landscape model. And then in the end, also you have to think about incident response and unfortunately the things that would happen the day after.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting how the risk awareness and the level of investment kind of run parallel to each other. Understanding one helps you to make better decisions in the other. And I think that's something that is overlooked from time to time, either because the reaction is all at once. We just got hit. We want to make sure this doesn't happen again. It's a little bit more knee-jerk than more analytical in looking at the process.
I think you're absolutely right, Jeff. And I think, risk management is a very individual. We all, as people, have our own risk tolerance. We all have our way of thinking about the world. And it can be even simple things about how optimistic a person is or pessimistic against certain events, right? And so while there is a lot of more formalized study of risk management, for instance, insurance company has actuaries, people that are studying the different percentage. I mean, security is not always there. And depending on the company and the nature, they might not have the resource and the ability to start compiling the data of the likelihood of an employee double clicking on a phishing. So a lot of it ends up being translated by the CISO or the security department to the business. And look, sometimes those people don't do a good enough job representing it. And again, it's okay. It's sometimes the business is not open to hearing that as well. Right? Sometimes the business want to hear, let's allocate that money to sell more, to make more profits, to launch a new product, not necessarily to boil down and make things better security-wise on our existing products. And, this topic has been discussed, in the security community all the time. And my personal opinion on that is that for most products that we buy as individuals, security not always playing a big role. When you think about the latest gadget that you might see, the latest thing that you might want to buy for yourself, I mean, you not necessarily start asking questions like, what kind of encryption does this has? Or what's the GDPR practice of that company? All of the time it's like, I want this. I think it looks cool. I think I'm going to like how it's going to work. So in some regards, in some businesses, it's easier to say, well, security is a nice to have. Again, this is where we have a big debate about the government stepping in and regulation and why certain things are being mandated on companies, even when they don't understand necessarily why they should be doing it. I mean, they understand, but they deprioritizing it. But it all comes down to risk management is really up to the individual and the company politics at that point in time. Some manage to do it, some can't. And I can tell you from experience, you talk to a company before they got hacked, and after they got hacked, same company, same business, same numbers, two different conversations. And it's not because you were changing the pitch. It's not because you were, doing something significantly different. Is once they experience that event and they understand that it's no longer, it won't happen to me. It's not likely to happen to me. I've never heard about something that happened to this kind of company. Once they go through the process, they come out better and smarter. Now, of course, with the price to pay, they got breached. Yeah. But sometimes it's what it takes for companies to wake up. It's unfortunate, but it's the reality.
No, I agree with you. I hear about it way too often, way too frequently, especially when it comes to manufacturers. You're talking about the supply chain proximity and the role that plays. We're seeing a lot of smaller to medium-sized manufacturers getting hit more frequently. They don't know how to respond, and unfortunately, it continues to happen until they do start putting plans in place. So at the end of the day, it's like we have got a ton of challenges out there, but we know that there's also some solutions. Yep. Maybe that kind of segue a little bit into what you guys do at SafeBreach. Maybe you can talk to us a little bit about the company and some of the solutions you offer.
Yeah, I would love to. So SafeBreach was co-founded by myself and my partner Guy Bejarano. And basically what we felt like was missing in the industry almost 11 years ago was not necessarily a new shiny gizmo, as we just said, but actually the knowledge. And the knowledge here is how the offensive, how the adversaries are working. We believe that there is an asymmetrical warfare. If you think about it in a very kind of simple sport analogy, thinking that, I'm going to try to kind of throw 100 balls in you and you need to throw and pitch every one of them, right? Realistically, 100 balls, one will pass you through, right? So it's not a thing of if you'll get hacked, it's when you get hacked. And so if you're already open to that idea, showing you the different ways and how will they manifest within your company is a knowledge that can help you improve and do decisions better. Now, the power of this idea of understanding the adversary, of doing adversarial simulations, is that it doesn't happen at the moment when you get hacked. Many companies do end up doing a lot of what, our customers gets to do before, just during an IR, which is obviously harder. It's obviously in a disadvantage. It's a reactive play. What we're claiming is you don't need to get hacked to understand how you're going to get hacked. What you need is to see how that offensive knowledge is going to be implemented. And through a series of deployment of simulators and running these war games across the different parts of your company in a continuous manner, you can catch up with drifts. You can get educated about how the latest threats out there are applicable to your company. And with that wisdom, you can do anything. You can change policies. You can change different solutions. You can create new playbooks for the human element to show them, look, when you see A, B, and C on a screen, it really just translates into this attack. So this is what I would expect you to do. It gives you the power to be prepared. And this has been helpful across the industry. We have customers from all the different verticals. And again, the commonality, as I said, they all understand that it's not if they're going to get hacked, it's when they're going to get hacked. And they want to get ahead of the process. They want to be informed and not just hope that whatever they have deployed or configured would work when the time would come.
Yeah, really interesting. And a couple kind of follow-ups there. Number one, in terms of these simulations that you're doing, and it's in response to, first of all, understanding it's customized according to the company and their situation and how
we have
they're
a
viewing
hacker
risk.
playbook. The customers can choose different threats. They're tagged based on the threat group. They're tagged based on the vertical, but based on the operation system. So of course, they're free to choose, and they can also add their own and some customizable options as well.
Has there been any type of simulation that you've seen, I guess for lack of a better term, trending? Is there a certain type of thing that manufacturers or your clients are really looking to do more of?
Yeah, so I would say, there's a couple of easy ones. So whenever there comes to be a public news of a company in a certain vertical that got hacked by a certain threat actor or a certain name of a ransomware, obviously everybody wants to test themselves, right? Because once the news out there that there's already a company that got hit, everybody wants to answer to their leadership, how safe are we against this threat? And this unfortunately happens every now and then. Something makes it to the media, makes it to the newspaper, and so everybody's kind of chasing it. Another thing that happens every so now and then, whenever there is some geolocation tension between, the US or Europe or different countries, and then there is the fear of retaliation on the cyber arena, then of course everybody wants to understand what past attacks are attributed to these state nation and test themselves against it. Obviously, it doesn't indicate, past indication doesn't necessarily means they're going to be reusing it, but you can understand certain level of sophistication, certain level of techniques that if you are prepared against, then the likelihood of them recycling them in the future, and we've seen those in going forward, you can see that innovation in offensive, while there's a lot of innovation sometimes on the 0 day, the rest of the chains, the implants, the C2 channels, the exfiltration, these tends to recycle every now and then. Not to say that there is no innovation there, but a lot of the times they're more of a cookie cutter. The focus is almost always on the infiltration, which tends to be the 0 day, the novelty of how you got in. But back to your question, so yeah, whenever there is a famous breach, everybody wants to understand how they're compared to it. Whenever there's some geolocation tension, customers want to understand what potentially that nation state can do if they're in that area, if they're operating in that region. And last but not least, as I said, customers that have their own checklist on their CTI, who are the threat groups that are out there after their industry at large. Whenever they see a new ransomware, a new tool that has been associated with that threat group, they will then run it, knowing that, again, these tools most likely are pointed at them as we speak.
Sure. No, it makes sense. And then the second part of what you guys do in providing that knowledge and understanding sort of post-breach or post-simulation, ideally in developing, I would think, a good response plan or deterrent plan. That's where I think manufacturing right now is really struggling. I think we've gotten a ton better in terms of identifying our assets, understanding how to protect them. But when we do get hacked, that response part is still a struggle. What have you seen in terms of the more important parts to incorporate into these plans, or how are folks doing overall just in taking that knowledge, those things that we're learning, and then developing a plan around them?
So I think you nailed it, and it's yet another something that is kind of interesting in this asymmetrical arena is that by nature companies are running in silos. People that run the endpoint are not necessarily the people that run the network. The OT is separated from the IT. It could be two different teams. Sometimes even depending on the geolocation, you can have different teams in different countries running the same vertical. Hackers are not operating in silo. Hackers are very goal-driven. They have a very clear objective in mind, and they will do whatever they can to get to that end game. So it all comes down into this triaging. And today, the popular term for it is detection engineering, is understanding how all your controls either report back into a single source of truth or even working together to identify the attacks. And this is really where you start thinking in terms of timelines, right? Like the EDR at the corporation that's supposed to kick in if an employee will click on a malicious link. That network firewall that should prevent any attacks to any attempts to jump from the IT to the OT networks. This is how you would like to understand when running the attack from A to Z, from top to bottom, how the different parts are collaborating together. Now, again, depending on, the different, companies and their appetite, it could be sending all of them to a single repository. It could be split between the IT and the OT. But the idea of understanding whether you have detection or not, and whether this detection is drifting or not, is the key to develop a good plan, because eventually what you would like to tell people is that if you see this event, it's not a fire drill, it's the real deal, and that this is what I expect you to do to, again, minimize the impact as soon as possible. But if this event never arrives, then people are watching at the screen, but they're not aware of, right? And so it is important not just to train as you said, the response plan, but to make sure the plumbing is constantly working and verified. And again, going back to my earlier theme about complexity, this is where real life hits those companies. Opening another site, changing a firewall, changing a VPN vendor. They were pretty sure it still works that way. Apparently it's not. They just did a little bit of an update. They really thought the update was just fixing a bug. Apparently it's changed the configuration. It's no longer reporting that way. It's those little things that creates complexity, and eventually the hackers are maneuvering around those, again, inconsistency. And then you only get left with the incident response plan as your only way of mitigating the attack. But detection engineering, it's all about understanding ahead of the time how well are you prepared, and then making sure that the plan, when it is happening, is solid and exercised as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. Our audience has heard me lecture plenty about the blocking and tackling, hitting all the small things, but it's good to reinforce those elements because that's really what it's all about. You hear about it so many in sort of the after action reviews of a lot of these hacks. It was a credentials thing. It was using the admin passwords. It was all of those types of things that we still continue to miss from time to time.
Yeah, and I'm sure if again in other in other realities, if you would interview these people, regardless of the breach that happened to them, they had stories about why those credentials were there, how they once were used by this app, how once the business wanted something, so they had to create them. I mean, again, if you put aside negligence and malicious intention, which by the way, it's also a threat for certain companies, insider threat. It's a very known fact that you can bribe somebody, you can pay somebody to stack a thumb drives or give their credentials in exchange of money. So I'm not discounting insider threat, but putting it aside here for a minute, there are reasons for all this legacy insecure behavior. And so they were kind of living with the risk, but kind of suppressing a little bit the implications of it. And again, it all goes back into risk management. How well do you understand your risk? What's bubbling up? What are you testing? Because to say the risk is always going to be there, right? But how are you measuring that risk is not drifting, and how you're measuring what's going to be an acceptable outcome as a result of that risk. Just because you have a risk doesn't mean that you 100% need to consent to get hacked and all the implications along with it. You can say, I allow people from all countries to connect to my company because I have employees all over the world, so I cannot do any IP limiting. However, I can add an MFA and a bunch of more authentications on the edge to ensure that the people that do get through are the one that really supposed to be there. So like I said, risk management is not an excuse to get hacked. It's an excuse to double down on where you have controls and where you can take control on the actions.
No, I think that's well said, because kind of what you were illustrating there is where a lot of people almost look for excuses why they cannot do some of these things and why they can't invest in certain areas, or they're not going to deal with it, as opposed to further analyzing those situations and looking where, okay, we can't do it completely a zero trust or whatever you want to say, but we can put other filters in there or other segmentations in there to at least make it harder for the hacker to do what they're going to do at a minimum. So
it might sound a little bit more stoicism, but applied to companies, it's controlling the controllables. Right? What is it within your power to control? You can control the adversary. You can control, when they're going to strike. You don't have any agreements with them. However, there are certain things that you can control. And again, there are things that you don't have the budget for. So again, you can control that, or at least you tried, but you don't have the budget to buy these other security measurements. So the ones that you do have, how do you get the best out of it? How do you really understand how to utilize it? And then what compensating controls and ideas you can put on top of it. So again, sometimes it's just easier to point out and say, if only I had this gizmo, this gadget, this multi-million-dollar budget that would have covered me. The reality is very few companies really get to the place where they buy everything and have everything. Almost every company has a commercial reality where they have to, balance a couple of different considerations for the business. And so security is another consideration. So controlling the controllable is the right mindset that would get you risk management by the numbers, as opposed to just have feelings and say, well, I feel like we're good in that area, and now I want to move on to do something else. Which again, if you have the data to back it up, that's great. But if you don't, then it's your word versus mine versus others, and it's not an empirical way to measure risk, I guess, at the end of the day.
Yeah, no, good point. Well, talking about the controllable and the uncontrollable sort of working together a little bit. Usually I don't bring up artificial intelligence unless it comes up organically in the conversation, but I am curious to kind of hear your thoughts in terms of where it makes sense, how is it being utilized, or just sort of your general thoughts on AI and cybersecurity.
Yeah. So, okay, first of all, I think we all kind of need to acknowledge that, the AI movement is definitely changing things in our industry. It changes things also that are adjacent to our industry. How people write code today is changing, and with that, there is some new risks. Vibe coding is definitely a movement that potentially can introduce security issues. In some cases, it's been proven that adversaries manage to poison some of those tools. So they will, by design, even introduce code that has backdoors or security flaws by design. So even if we're not looking just directly in how AI impacts security, just the understanding that AI is now becoming adopted by the business on multiple fronts, and those can now have security consideration as they always were. It's something that is kind of worth taking note on. But there is no doubt that at the point where we are right now, Jeff, AI is good at taking repetitive tasks or tasks that it can be very well trained off and do it faster. Again, the accuracy, we can park it for a minute, but it can handle things faster. And again, the accuracy level increases as the models become better and better at it. And we can all kind of think about, different, I would say, first tier, first level type of jobs that AI can help, again, at first place, augment and increase the velocity. We all know about the alert fatigues. There are just too many things beeping at the same time, not enough people to chase all those different lights. And sometimes people just ignore them or just dismiss them. And again, this is also, another fallacy that people getting tired of these repeated alerts and they don't trust those alerts in the first place, so they just keep ignoring them. So when you think about how AI can help, it can definitely reduce or, again, help with the alert fatigue by help creating another context, another intelligence, and help perhaps the operator to distinguish between something that seems to be more of the same versus, oh, we never saw that computer connecting to this country at midnight before. This is really something that you should be looking at right now. So again, there is no doubt that AI at the very least can help augment the tasks where there is a lot of overload and additional context at a highly speed, in a quick millisecond or whatnot, can help again distinguish for the human element what should draw their attention. Obviously from there, the more you want to imagine of how AI and AGI will arrive, it can replace more functions, it can make decisions, it can be autonomous, and the story goes on and on. But it's also important to mention that all these great benefits for the defenders are, again, the asymmetrical equation between offense and defense is still here. So think about how the same technology is now helping the bad guys. It used to be that in order to write a phishing email, you need to know the language of the victim, right? I mean, how else can you convince them to click on a link? Thanks to AI, you can now be fluent in all the languages in a matter of milliseconds, right? So cross-boundary, cross-languages, no longer an issue. Phishing in every language, any time of the day that you would like. Right? It used to be that to create different websites that, pretends to be the real website took some skills, again, creating HTML, maybe some photoshopping, whatever it is to make the website look authentic. Well, not anymore. Thanks to AI, you can create those mock-up websites. I mean, you can literally upload a picture and tell the AI, I would like you to make that website. And like, yeah, sure, I'll make you I'll take that picture and make it into a website. So it's never been easier today to fake things. Now, again, just kind of as I showed how far the rabbit hole can go for the defender, I would say when we talk about the offensive, things like deepfake, right? Things like deep voice faking. Imagine that you get a phone call from your manager that sounds exactly like your manager and is asking you to do something that could be potentially insecure. How much are you going to be willing to challenge that person? When you go on a Zoom meeting with a person that looks like your CEO of the company and he instructs you to download this application or do some certain tasks on your computer that eventually could lead the door into an attack, right? How many people are going to challenge the person that they're seeing on Zoom right now and saying, I don't think they sound like their CEO, they look like their CEO, but they're going to refuse and risk getting fired perhaps by not doing what they've been asked for. So, I mean, this is a very extreme examples, but again, this is just to show that the pendulum swings both ways. Whatever the defenders will use AI for, the attackers will then find a way to abuse those technology, and they already are. And then again, the asymmetrical relationship unfortunately stays the same.
No, I think it's another situation where we have to talk about all of these different potential situations and applications because there's just this need for awareness. We just need to know what we could be running into. It bleeds right back into everything you're talking about in terms of developing that plan and understanding your risk and what those acceptable levels are at different areas of the enterprise.
Sure. It always comes down to what do you believe will be the way that your company will get hired? Because if right now you're going to spend so much time telling people not to believe the people that they see in Zoom and find these kind of out of band ways to confirm that person on a Zoom meeting, you could be spending the resource and the time on just the wrong threat landscape all the way along. It could be just, again, an insider threat, or it could be an unpatched server or an unidentified asset that could be how the story started. So it's always, it always comes down to what do you understand about your company, your business, who's after you, your competitors, the countries that you operated in, your technology, what chances, what kind of vulnerabilities it has, what cadence of exploitation. This is where it all comes down to making those informed decisions. And then, as you said to yourself, following up on them. Because just making a one-time decisions is good. It's definitely a good beginning. But unfortunately, this is a continuous cycle. So just doing things once will not get you very far, because somewhere down the road, there's going to be a drift. And all that good work is probably going to go to waste. And again, unfortunately, reality will hit.
So let me throw one more at you, just because you're working with clients constantly, helping them solve problems. It just feels like sometimes we're so inundated with all the negative stuff that's going on as it relates to cybersecurity and all the challenges. Let me ask you this. What helps you sleep at night? What are some of the positive things that you see going on that when you lay down, you can be like, all right, there's all this stuff that we have to deal with, but there's some light at the end of the tunnel as well?
I think that, if there is one good thing that I can say about our industry is that we are moving forward, right? I mean, we are kind of adopting the lessons of the past. And, as you talk to especially the new generations of security leadership, you can see that the mindset are being shifted. And again, it all starts from if I'm going to get hacked into when I'm going to get hacked. So adopting proactive mindset, thinking about the risks, try to be more empirical about the way that we're going forward about this. This is definitely the mindset, again, going back into controlling the controllables. It's definitely become very apparent that it's no longer kind of putting your head in the sand and say it's not going to happen to me. And it's more about, I want to understand what's going to happen to me. I want to be ahead of it. I'm not always going to be able to change all the variables, but at least I want to be aware of it and see what I can really do to influence it, to minimize the risk. So it really is positive working in an industry that inspires to fix itself, that inspires to be better. Of course, we always want to make things better faster. Unfortunately, I don't control the timeline here, but the attitude is definitely positive. And I think this changes everything. The people are trying to do a better job every day. So that's what kind of helped me sleep at night.
Thanks, Itzik. And to check out the work he and his colleagues are up to, you can go to safebreach.com. I'd also like to thank you for joining us, and to catch up on past episodes, you can go to manufacturing.net, IEN.com, or mbtmag.com. You can also check out Security Breach wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple, Amazon, and Overcast. And if you have a cybersecurity story or topic that you'd like to have us explore on Security Breach, you can reach me at jeff@IEN.com. For Itzik Kotler, I'm Jeff Ranke, and this is Security Breach.